Building up Canada's defense capability. Is it something we can even do these days? Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist with the Toronto Sun. Canada's defense capability very much in question these days, especially in Washington, D.C., where the Americans wonder what we've been up to lately. Why haven't we reached our 2% of GDP defense goal, one of the requirements for being in NATO? Well, as that's being discussed, I wanted to bring in Peter MacKay. He's a partner at Deloitte, the consulting firm, and of course was Canada's defense minister from 2007 to 2013, among a few other roles he held in the Harper government. Peter, thanks for the time.
Pleasure, Brian. Good to be with you.
The issue of Canada's defense capabilities, we keep hearing that, well, we will get to 2% by 2030. That doesn't seem like it's fast enough for the Americans. Donald Trump, despite what some people might think, is not the first American president to raise the 2% issue. It was an annoyance for Joe Biden. It was an annoyance for Barack Obama. It was an annoyance for George Bush. Going back to Bill Clinton, they've been complaining about it. Do you think that this is being taken seriously enough in Ottawa these days with the current Trudeau government? Well, such as it is.
Frankly, no. And, even hearing Defense Minister Bill Blair, the current Defense Minister, say, well, yes, now we can get there in 2027. There's a big credibility gap. And the NATO meeting that took place in Washington just this past summer, again, we showed up without really a coherent position, said we weren't going to get there till 2030, as you said. But then at the very last minute, they said, oh, wait, yes, we will, and we're going to buy submarines. And unfortunately, everybody just rolled their eyes around the table. And it is correct, as you point out, that Canada has been sort of on the ropes and being pressed on getting to 2% of GDP spending on defense. And I was at many of those tables in Brussels and other places. But I would distinguish this demand and urgency now from that period because we were in Afghanistan. And we were contributing mightily, I would be quick to add, and we were on the ascent. We were actually moving quite rapidly towards 2% GDP spending, in large part because of that mission commitment, where we were purchasing heavy lift helicopters. We had bought Globemaster aircraft. We put heavy tanks and guns into the mix, and we were spending money, quite frankly, so forcefully and fast that the Department of National Defense budget couldn't absorb it. And that had a lot to do with the broken procurement process. But all of this to say is successive Americans and, quite frankly, other NATO partners have been asking for Canada to do more. Now, dollar for dollar, we spend a lot. We spend, I think, the fifth most of NATO countries. But as a percentage of our GDP, we're simply not there. And in fact, the numbers have fallen precipitously over the years.
Well, I mean, they're now claiming that you guys took it below 1% and they're spending more. I don't know how, when you're 14,000 troops short, how you're spending more. And, one of our great contributions to the battle in Ukraine recently was sending gender-based plus advisors to advise the Ukrainian military on how to do gender-based analysis of war. I have no idea why that would be of value to someone who's trying to survive being shot at by the Russians.
Well, and I think we sent some sleeping bags and maybe some winter gear, which is helpful to be sure, but it isn't what they need, when they're under attack from missiles and Russian aggression. We also, I think, had some stipulation around mine clearing that had a gender neutral base too. But anyway, all of that aside, Canada can and should do all that we're able to do in support of Ukraine. And we've sent equipment, we've sent some armored vehicles. But here's the problem, Brian, we're not replacing it. And we're not doing enough on the recruitment and retention of the current Canadian forces. It isn't apparently as attractive as it was in the past to a whole generation of Canadians. And that, is we could unpack that, but part of it is not opening up certain trades, technical trades, and simply having a culture that says the Canadian Armed Forces is a warrior-based group. They are there to defend Canada, Canada's interest, our allies' interest, North America's interest, and we've somehow moved away from that in a way that has made people very uncomfortable about what the Canadian forces do. They are armed. They are taught to be lethal in their trade as far as how they protect Canada. And they sign up with unlimited liability. That is, they're willing to put their lives on the line.
My very first day of general military training, what we used to call basic training, staff sergeant at the front of the classroom saying, you know, we'd all been given I think we started with FNs and I finished with the C7, but we'd all been given a rifle, and the staff sergeant is saying, what is this for? And people had all kinds of answers. And he said, no, it is to kill people. That's a wake-up call when you're in there. But you're right, that's gone. But in terms of equipment, I mean, you guys were going through the F-35 purchase, which the Liberals fully opposed. You were dragged through the mud. You had to restart that process again, claiming that it was somehow not legitimate. Even though, I mean, this project had been well, it wasn't a competitive bid. You got to do it again. It started under Jean Chrétien. That's how far back the project goes. It had been selected and gone through an entire rigorous bidding process. But we don't have proper fighter jets. We don't have a deep water port in the Arctic. We don't have proper submarines. I understand why the Americans are getting upset that they have to do so much of the heavy lifting on our defense. I know that you watched the interview I did with Steve Bannon the other day. They are very concerned about the Arctic, and you heard Donald Trump saying that the other day in the Oval Office, that there are Chinese and Russian ships up there and we can't do anything about it. Should we be moving in that direction of being serious about buying subs, not throwing it out last minute when your assignment's due and teacher says, what are you up to?
And the dog ate my homework. But they absolutely need that capability of submarines that can be submersed under deep ice in the Arctic. And, you know, our government, the Harper government, did begin the very arduous process of putting a deep water refueling station in Nanisivik. Very difficult, the short construction season, hard to get fuel stuff there. It's challenging, but it was well underway. And I don't want to sound defensive about it, but the reason we fell short of 2% is the recession hit in 08, 09. And we were drawing down in Afghanistan, and the public, sadly, had moved as far as support for massive military spending. Now, I think they're back. I think the Canadian public have had an awakening. I think that they're ahead of the politicians on this, although I do note that Pierre Poilievre has come out with quite a comprehensive Arctic strategy that involves having that deep water refueling capability and an airfield, an actual base in Iqaluit, which is what we need.
You mentioned Navicivic. I want you to explain people what that is, because you guys started this and it's still not operational as far as I can tell, or maybe it's about to become operational.
It's not. I think it's on the cusp of it, but here we are 15 years after the beginning of that process, and we're still not able to refuel Arctic offshore patrol vessels, a whole new generation of surface combatants, as you know, icebreakers. There has to be that capability to operate in a self-sustained way in the Arctic with something as basic as fuel. And you can't get our refuelers up there at certain times of the year because of the ice, but it's opening. And that's, again, to your point about why the Americans are really sounding the alarm. The waters are opening. And here's the other important factor, Brian. The Russians are totally recapitalizing their side of the Arctic Ocean. So they're putting more airfields in place. They're, I suspect, strongly putting missiles there. They're putting their aircraft in place so that they can continue to menace and God forbid, have first strike capability in the Arctic. And that's why the Russians are such a threat. Were it not for Ukraine, they would be all in on the Arctic. And the Americans know that. Their intelligence tells them that. Their satellite surveillance tells them that. And they're asking Canada, they're imploring us to do more. And it isn't enough to just virtue signal or say we're going to do these things. We have to make investments in hard military infrastructure and power. And that's what they're calling for. And they have been for some time.
The China, I remember when President Hu came to visit Prime Minister Harper, there was a story planted in Chinese media just before they arrived saying that China is an Arctic nation. They are 20% of the world's population. They deserve 20% of the resources under the Arctic. They are still claiming Arctic resources. They want to drill for oil and gas up there, and they think they get to control it. They're sending their ships up there. China is always moving in strategic terms, and I just don't think that the leadership in Ottawa thinks in those terms. They think
No, they
we're
don't.
Canada. Who would want to harm us? Well, China.
Well, we're clearly going through a bit of a renaissance in terms of our awareness, even of the need to protect our sovereignty, to project that sovereignty into the Arctic. And you're right. The Chinese have for a long time coveted the resources there. They call themselves a near Arctic neighbor. They want to be an associate at the Arctic Council. And they have Chinese resource vessels that go through Arctic waters. We saw this, farcical parody play out where a weather balloon was drifting across the continent. They have their sights set on the Arctic. They also want to be able to transit those waters for shipping. That's a very important part of their plan. And they're building icebreakers and aircraft carriers. There's no ice in Beijing Harbor, and that's not for coastal patrol. They are clearly preparing for the next century. And that's the way they tend to think in the Politburo, is how do we prepare ourselves for the long term? So we had best get ready. I remember Prime Minister Harper was fond of saying we need to use it or lose it. And the Americans are getting tired of sort of carrying all the weight when it comes to North America. NORAD is the place where a lot of the planning would be done. Our North Command in Winnipeg, we've got to have capability, and that definitely includes F-35s. I mean, we should have had these 10 years ago. And the 88 that are ordered are less than half of what we actually need.
It's discouraging to watch. Hopefully, some smart people in Ottawa, obviously not those elected with the Trudeau government, start getting things right. Peter MacKay, thanks so much for the time.
Sure thing, Brian. Take care.
Let me know what you think. Drop a comment down below. Share this on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.